You boys be quiet down there!
Welcome back to PC-98 Paradise, the series where we take a close look at classic games for the NEC PC-98, the most popular Japanese PC series of the early 1990s. In a video I made last year, we looked at Hideo Kojima's 1988 graphic adventure game Snatcher on the NEC PC-88, and today's game is often considered to be Kojima's follow-up to that game, Policenauts, originally released in 1994 on the NEC PC-9821. So first of all, what is a PC-9821? Most of the time when we talk about PC-98 games, we're referring to games for the NEC PC-9801, NEC's 16-bit PC series that started way back in 1982 and continued into the 90s. And indeed, every game I've covered up to now on PC-98 Paradise has been a PC-9801 game. PC-9821 was NEC's next series of PCs that started in 1992, and was named so because it was intended to bring PC-98 into the 21st century. Spoiler alert, it didn't really. Though the very last PC-9821 left the factory in 2003, the PC-9821 was already effectively dead by the late 90s, when NEC's competitors were selling cheaper Windows PCs which used the same IBM-compatible architecture that we still use today in the West. Even NEC themselves started offering such PCs in addition to their 9821s, starting in 1997. So there's only a modest list of a few hundred games ever released for the PC-9821, whereas the 9801 had several thousand. So I mostly use my PC-9821 for its backward compatibility with PC-9801 software. But what makes 9821s different? Well, generally 9821s can run PC-98 Windows, and tend to offer some higher color and resolution modes, in addition to the 16-color 640x400 graphics of the PC-9801. This particular PC-9821 is an early model from 1993, which handles only up to 640x480 and a 256 color mode. So how is Policenauts going to take advantage of that? Well, you'll see. So here's Policenauts for PC-9821. A complete copy of the game easily sells for several $100s, and when I bought mine, I hate to say I cheaped out and bought a very incomplete one. It originally came in a cardboard box that, due to its awkward size and shape, was often thrown away. The back of the game has a long list of PC-9821 models this will run on, and it says that the game consists of a CD-ROM plus a 3.5-inch floppy disk. There's a message here for those who have 5-inch floppy drives instead of 3.5 to kindly send the 3.5-inch disc to Konami, and they'll send you a 5-inch copy in exchange. Inside, first of all we have the game itself, which is stored on a single CD-ROM, as opposed to the console versions of Policenauts, which all consist of multiple discs. Then we have a short color manual explaining how to install and play the game. On the back, there's a chart which you'll need to solve a puzzle at one point in the game. There's also a survey card in here, and one interesting question in the survey says that there's a 3DO version of Policenauts planned. Do you think you'll buy it? Open up the second compartment of the jewel case, and we can see that, unfortunately, my copy of the game is missing something important. The system disk. This isn't it. This is a user disk that a previous owner made. However, I was able to get the game running with only what I have here, by making some minor changes to the user disk in order to suit my PC-98 setup. But for posterity's sake, I want to show what the actual installation process looks like, by borrowing a copy of the system disk. The installer is designed to be idiot-proof, but of course that just makes it even harder to use if your setup differs at all from what Konami assumed you would have. The following is the correct process for my system, which I figured out after a few hours of trial and error. But this is still going to take a little longer to install than the games I normally show on this channel, so I hope you're buckled in for the best part of the video. The main thing the installer does is create a user disk, which will not only store your game saves, but also act as the boot disk for the game. So first, the manual says to insert a blank disk in drive 1, and use this exact command to format it. The /S will make it a bootable system disk, and the /M will make it only a 1.2 megabyte PC-98 formatted floppy. I'm going to change this to /4 to make it a 1.44 megabyte floppy, just like the ones we used in the West, which PC-98 21s can also read. I'm doing it this way because I'm using DOS 6 instead of 5, and with DOS 6, I found that the necessary files Policenauts needs won't fit on a 1.2 megabyte disk. Once the disk is formatted, the manual says to replace it with the Policenauts system disk and run the inst.exe contained on it. Now the beautiful little installer is up and running. Hey, it shows Ed wielding a gun. Is that a spoiler? Anyway, it will ask you to immediately take out the system disk and put the user disk back in. It needs to copy some DOS drivers over to the user disk and asks which of your drives you keep DOS on. I'll select my main hard drive A, and it finds and copies all the drivers it needs. Next, it has me insert the system disk in drive 2 to copy some files from it to the new user disk. Then it says the system will reset and boot from the newly created user disk. Back in the installer, it asks if you want to install the game to the hard drive. Surprisingly, you don't need a hard drive to run Policenauts. If you want, you can have it load all the data directly from the CD-ROM as you play. But to improve performance, I'll choose to install. And then there's an option to also install graphic data to further improve performance, which I'll choose to do. And it asks us to insert the CD-ROM. Regulars of the channel probably noticed that I replaced my CD-ROM drive. I had some success repairing the tray on that one with a 3D printed gear in order to make it open and close again, but unfortunately the lens just wouldn't read CDs reliably, and I couldn't determine what kind of lens I would need to replace it with. Hopefully the new owner will have better luck with it than I did. This one is an older model which has been surprisingly reliable for me so far. It's actually a top loader, which we push in once in order to slide it out, open the lid, and snap the Policenauts CD firmly in place, since this is a double-speed drive. Policenauts uses Redbook CD audio at a couple of points, and the only way to get that with this system is through the headphone jack on the front of the drive, so we'll connect a stereo audio cable from here to the input on the back of the PC-98, and then adjust the volume dial to the appropriate level. Not the most elegant solution, but it's the only way. Back to the installer. It'll take a moment to copy the files from the CD-ROM to the hard drive, but once it's all finished, installation is finally complete. It says to make sure to keep the system disk somewhere where you won't lose it, but the fact of the matter is, you no longer need the system disk once you have the game installed, which is probably why so many people chose to keep their user disk in here instead of the system disk, and then of course lost the system disk at some point. Which is why you'll see so many copies of this game on the used market where the system disk is missing. Anyway, to start the game, we simply power up with both the user disk and the CD-ROM inserted. The first thing we see is the early 90s Konami logo with a CD rendition of that familiar sound. From the title screen on, we're going to need a mouse connected, and the keyboard does absolutely nothing throughout the entire game. We can only choose to start a new game, and then a black screen with a voice tells us that a screening of Policenauts is about to begin. This is an imitation of the announcement that used to play at Japanese movie theaters before the feature presentation. Kojima clearly wanted Policenauts to be a cinematic experience.
With Snatcher and Policenauts, I went for the adventure game format, since the methods used, such as camera work and shots, are the same techniques used in filmmaking. So while I could have conveyed the same things in a Metal Gear-like action game, I wanted to emphasize the visuals and camera work.
The opening sequence begins. This, the Konami logo, and the end credits are the only parts which use the CD Redbook audio. I love the opening track titled Old LA 2040, which is never used in the console versions of the game, aside from a short low-quality clip you can hear at the CD rack. This track also includes the main theme melody of Policenauts. This melody is probably even better known throughout the world as the tune that plays over the Konami logo in the first Metal Gear Solid. That exact version is actually from Policenauts, in fact. As a bonus, there's an even longer version of the opening music you can hear on track 5 of the CD-ROM, which is never used in the game. Gotta love that distinct Roland MIDI-sounding bass guitar. That sound practically carried Japanese CD-ROM games through the 90s. In the console versions, this opening is replaced by a much shorter full-motion video sequence, showing some of the same iconic shots. It's not that PC-9821 can't do FMV, but this game doesn't anyway. The PC-9821 opening is much slower paced, giving us plenty of time to enjoy the music and take in the game's initial setting of old Los Angeles in 2040. Then, near the end, the photographs and newspaper articles from Jonathan's office scroll slowly past, with Japanese translations of each of the headlines. While the FMV in the console versions is also nice, I really love the pixel art used here in the original. I'm not noticing a big difference though between these PC-9821 graphics and the ones I've seen in regular PC-9801 games, and in fact, there isn't any. Policenauts uses only the same old 640x400 resolution and 16 on-screen colors as the 9801. It doesn't take advantage of the PC-9821's graphic capabilities whatsoever, and in fact, Japanese Wikipedia says Policenauts will run just fine on a PC-9801 as long as it has a CD-ROM drive, the necessary soundboard, and a decently fast CPU. Wait, what? But I told my viewers we're doing our first PC-9821 game here. What the hell kind of false advertising is this, Konami? But okay, to be fair, apparently there are quite a few PC-9821 games like this that only use the old 9801 graphic mode, and as I learned only recently, there actually aren't any firm requirements as to what constitutes a PC-9821 versus 9801. They may have chosen to market it as a 9821 game just because 9821s at the time were more likely to have a CD-ROM drive and the required soundboard. Another possible reason Konami chose to use the old graphic mode given by Japanese Wikipedia is because they wanted to also support the 9821B series, which only had the old graphic mode. Or I think it could also be due to the fact that the game was already in development before the first PC-9821 was even released in 1992. But whatever the reason, I was kind of bummed when I first learned this game doesn't use the 256 color mode, but I eventually chose to look at it in a positive light. If you want a higher color, more scanned anime cell looking version of the game, we have the 3 console versions. But in the PC-98 version, we get the opportunity to experience more of a 16-bit pixel art rendition of the game. The console versions definitely look newer, but the PC-98 version is actually higher resolution, and I've heard many opine that the PC-98 graphics have actually aged a lot better. Sound-wise, everything is already here in the PC-98 version. It uses the exact same music and voice samples as the console versions. The sound quality is maybe a little worse than any of the console versions, but not that much worse. In this video, I've been using music from the soundtrack CD to make things a little easier on your ears, but here's what the game actually sounds like.
俺はジョナサン・イングラム。30年前、スペースコロニーのビヨンドコーストでポリスノーツとして働いていた。
By PC-98 standards, it sounds great. It uses only the PC-98 stereo FM soundboard, but only for its PCM capabilities. According to some sources, the soundboard only has one PCM channel, while others say 2, and the reason for this discrepancy, I believe, is because normally the 2 sound channels are used in tandem to create stereo PCM. But here in Policenauts, one channel is used for short, looping monaural BGM samples loaded into RAM, and the other for voices. And here in Jonathan's office at the beginning of the game, the BGM channel is used for the ambient sounds heard outside, rather than music. Anyway, those of you unfamiliar with Policenauts may be wondering what the story is about. You take control of Jonathan Ingram, who is part of an elite team of 5 police officers charged with enforcing the law on mankind's first space colony, who were known as the Policenauts.
So we asked ourselves, who's behind the badge?
Police?
Knots. Policenauts. During a routine spacewalk, an accident occurred which caused Jonathan to be lost in space in cryogenic sleep for 25 years. The game takes place in 2040, 3 years after Jonathan was rescued, and Jonathan is working as a private detective in Old Los Angeles. The new Los Angeles was apparently established further north, since it snows now in Old LA. To Jonathan, the events of 30 years ago feel as if they happened only a few years ago. He compares himself to Urashima Taro, a character in Japanese folklore who goes on a magical journey for several days, only to return and find that over 100 years have passed while he was gone. The plot begins when Jonathan is visited by his ex-wife, Lorraine, who asks him to help her find her husband, who she married while Jonathan was away and presumed dead. He mysteriously disappeared 3 weeks earlier on the space colony, where Lorraine now lives, leaving only some strange capsules and a half of a leaf as clues. Jonathan will have to return to the space colony beyond Coast, where his accident took place, and confront his past, as well as the future of mankind. Space travel has now become commonplace, so Jonathan rides on a space plane to get to the colony.
The bumps you feel are asteroids smashing into the hull of this ship. Also, we're flying without a navigational system and can't seem to change course.
Miss, are you telling us absolutely everything?
Not exactly. We're also out of coffee.
It's funny that Jonathan seems to always have a never-ending cigarette in his mouth, but he clarifies at one point that while on Beyond Coast, he just likes to keep it in his mouth without lighting it, since smoking is strictly prohibited on the space colony. There, Jonathan meets up with the other main character of Policenauts, his old partner Ed Brown. Throughout most of the game, Jonathan and Ed will carry out investigations together here on Beyond Coast. The duo draws obvious inspiration from buddy cop movies. There's even the classic scene where they get chewed out by the chief after an action scene where they endangered the public.
Well, McGonagall, Billy is dead. They slit his throat from ear to ear.
Hey, I'm trying to eat lunch here.
Jonathan is 30, while Ed is now 25 years older at 55. He's a bit of a wash-up, having been put in charge of a misfit section of the police precinct, and hoping to quietly retire soon, though helping with Jonathan's case is definitely not gonna allow him to do that. Whereas the original version of Snatcher on the PC-98 used the number keys to make selections and control the game, Policenauts is a point-and-click adventure where you move the mouse cursor to investigate objects or talk to people. You can also click anywhere in the black areas to access the system menu and save your game to the user disk. The game generally does a better job than most point-and-click adventures of giving you the feeling that you're gradually solving a mystery through asking questions and hearing various conversations. However, at many points I still got that familiar feeling where it seems like just an exercise in figuring out where you need to click before the game will just let you move on. The mood and flow of the game does remind me a lot of Snatcher, but I would say Policenauts is generally much easier to figure out and progress, and is extremely linear. No walkthroughs were used in this playthrough. However, it also feels quite long for an adventure game of the time, with a total of 7 acts, plus a prologue and an epilogue, though only acts 1 and 2 are significantly long. All dialogue important to the story is spoken aloud and performed by well-known voice actors of the time. For many of the scenes, there are these animated character portraits that appear over the main graphics, in order to show the characters' facial expressions. I'm not sure why, but these are only in the PC-98 version. The amount of voices in Policenauts is truly impressive for an adventure game on any system in 1994, but to have a break from the usual text-heavy games on the PC-98 was a real treat. I've always loved games with voiced dialogue, and I'm not used to getting quite this much of a multimedia experience on this system.
As for the dialogue, we recorded a lot of stuff for the PC-98-21 version, but most of it ended up being unused. We ended up making even more cuts for the 3DO version than we did for the PC-98-21 version.
Wow, there's already so much, even after the cuts. I can't imagine how much time the voice actors for Jonathan and Ed must have spent in the studio. One obstacle to creating an English patch for the PC-98 version is the fact that unlike the console versions, there are no captions shown on screen during any of the spoken dialogue, though after you finish the game you do get the option to play a voiceless mode that has text instead. There's no way to get both the text on screen and the voices at the same time. Thus, to make a proper English patch, the game would have to be majorly reprogrammed in order to add text timed to the dialogue. This would be no small task, so do keep that in mind before asking why there's no patch for this version. Maybe as a temporary solution, the voiceless mode could be translated someday if someone manages to figure out how to replace the text. But a patch without voices wouldn't really do the PC-98 version justice, in my opinion, though it might be better than nothing for fans who have already experienced one of the other versions of the game with the voices. In addition to the investigation scenes, like in Snatcher, you will occasionally have to pull out your gun. The point-and-click shooting interface is definitely an improvement over Snatcher's number pad shooting. In the PC-98 version, there's no auto-targeting, and the only way to reload is by clicking in the black area around the sides of the screen. The difficulty is generally pretty reasonable, though if you're looking for a real challenge, you can try the shooting range at the police station. That's sure to put you in your place real quickly. There are also a couple of puzzles and mini-games, the most famous of which is definitely the bomb disposal scene, where Ed instructs you step by step how to disassemble the bomb. This unfortunately was a bit of a nightmare for me in the PC-98 version.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
This is one of the parts of the game where the characters break the fourth wall and comment about how they keep screwing up and dying. Ed also tells Jonathan to use the left button to use the tools. Incidentally, I noticed these voices weren't re-recorded for the console versions. I think it's pretty obvious though that you have to use the confirm trigger button when he says left button. The challenge is reasonable except for this part, where you need to navigate this piece of metal out of the maze without touching the sides. It may not look difficult, but I had trouble moving the mouse in a straight line. Having to watch the game over screen and listen to all the voices over and over again in order to finally try again started to become too much. No matter what optical mouse I plugged into this USB to PC-98 mouse adapter, I found the movement had a slight vertical flutter to it that normally doesn't cause me any issues. I wonder if a real PC-98 ball mouse would have actually worked better, but I don't currently have one. What I actually found worked best for me was this USB wireless wand, which I use to control my computer while watching videos from the couch. This is the last thing I would have thought would give me accurate control, but for some reason it was the only thing I had that allowed me to move the cursor in a perfectly straight line. I moved it around with two hands while desperately holding my breath. I felt like I was playing a real-life Ira Bo game, like the ones Irritating Stick for PS1 and Irritating Maze for Neo Geo are based on. Anyway, this is how I managed to somehow clear this, but they must have gotten a lot of feedback on this part from frustrated players, since it was majorly changed in the console versions. First of all, the view is straight down instead of at an angle, making it easier to see the edges, and if you screw up a couple of times, you can actually ask Ed to give it a try for you instead, though he will also screw it up the first time he tries. The maze also eventually gets replaced with easier ones, which doesn't happen in the original.
If you ask Ed to do it once, it becomes easier, and if you do it yourself afterward, it becomes difficult. In the end, it becomes so easy that anyone could do it.
Other differences between the PC-98 and console versions include the way the computers in the game look, and the designs of the graphics in some certain scenes. The AI assistant in Victor's lab, named Gorby, actually looks like Mikhail Gorbachev in the PC-98 version. Also, while these are in the console versions as well, I wanted to point out some Easter eggs. Meryl's tattoo is the Foxhound Special Force Group logo from Metal Gear. There's also one scene where you can see a very pixelated version of what is obviously a Snatcher calendar for the year 2042, the year when Snatcher is supposed to take place. This is based on a real calendar that Konami gave away in 1993, by the way. Snatcher is often considered to be sort of a proto-Policenauts, though that's not to say that Policenauts is necessarily better than Snatcher. The plots of the two games are very similar in many ways. Although Jonathan doesn't have amnesia, both he and Gillian are in very similar situations, and there are other characters who seem like they are analogs of characters from Snatcher. The game has many of the same story beats as Snatcher, and there are more than a few plot twists in Policenauts that, though not taken from Snatcher, are really quite predictable. Though again, that's not to say Policenauts is bad. Much like Snatcher, Policenauts manages to create a unique feel and mood that will stick with you after the game. I really love the credits BGM, which is a medley of many tunes heard throughout the game. After hearing all these as monaural PCM throughout such a long game, these tunes are like old friends by the time you get here. Kazuki Muraoka is listed as sound director, and there are also 3 composers listed under him. Masahiro Ikariko, aka Ika-chan, was also one of the main composers of Snatcher, SD Snatcher, Metal Gear 2, and too many other Konami classics to name. Tappy, or Tappy Iwase, was a composer for Metal Gear Solid 1, Contra 3, and again many other classics. And Motoaki Furukawa also worked on Castlevania 3 and Super C. Holy crap. And again, way too many classics. Like in Snatcher, Hideo Kojima's name appears several times throughout the credits. It was his passion project, and so much of the game was made by him on his own, including most of the writing and storyboarding. Other famous Konami people who appear here are too numerous to list, but I want to also mention Tomiharu Kinoshita, who was the character designer for both Policenauts and Snatcher. So I've shown you the credits for Policenauts, but that's all I'm going to show you of the ending. Policenauts is another game that I just can't spoil here in this video in good conscience, even with a spoiler warning. You've really got to play through a version of this game for yourself. And speaking of versions, let's talk briefly about the other ones, 2 of which have English patches. The first console considered worthy for a Policenauts port was the 3DO, and Policenauts was to be the only Konami game for the system. It was released the following year, and is almost, but not quite, a complete remake of the game, utilizing the voice samples from the PC-98 version and only a few added music tracks. The full motion video scenes added throughout the game were done by the animation company AIC, and all the graphics in the game were redrawn with more color to make them match the look of the animation. A few very short scenes and lines of recorded dialogue were taken out here and there. However, many frames of animation were added, and some unused inconsequential dialogue originally recorded for the PC-98 version were added into the game for the first time. This and all the console versions are compatible with the mouse accessories for their respective systems, and can be rather tedious to play with a controller. However, the shooting sections are made easier with the addition of auto-targeting with the shoulder buttons, and the option to use a trigger button to reload. The PlayStation version was released the following year. This one is almost an exact port of the 3DO version. However, the frame rate of the video was reduced down to only 15 FPS from the 3DO's 24. This was the first version to receive an English fan translation back in 2009. Finally, the Saturn port was released later the same year as the PS1 version. This one is often considered to be the definitive edition of the game, adding back in a lot of material from the PC-98 version, and also including bonus material that was originally sold on separate discs on the 3DO and PS1. The FMV frame rate in this one is back up to 24 FPS, but unfortunately looks even worse due to the graininess. It's the only version which includes light gun support for the shooting sections, but this reportedly just makes the game harder. This one also received an English patch in 2016.
I think the Saturn version is the most charming. The PC-98 version was the first, so I do have an attachment to it. And when the PlayStation version came out, I remember thinking, this is the best. But after some time passed, I started to think differently. It's pretty minor, but there were some detailed lines that suggested sub-stories, and we had to remove those lines in the PlayStation version. But now, we've added them back for the Saturn.
Policenauts is a graphic adventure you really ought to play through if you have the time, especially if you're a fan of the genre or Kojima's other games. In my opinion, the advantages aren't great enough to say that you have to play the Saturn version. The differences are all minor and inconsequential to the story. Play it on whatever platform you prefer. I've played all the way through the PC-98 and PlayStation versions, but as a PC-98 fan, I'm sure you can guess which is my personal favorite. I want to give a shout out to Bowl of Lentils for lending his voice as Hideo Kojima once again. Go check out his channel if you haven't already. His early history of Falcom video is required viewing if you have even a slight curiosity about the game company. I also loved his History of Leaf and video on The Other Mystery House. Also loved his video on the Korean game Arcturus and how it inspired Falcom's Trails in the Sky. And I've got to give a huge thanks to patrons and channel members as always. I really appreciate all the support, guys. This has been Mr. Jakes on PC-98 Paradise. Thanks for watching.